So sad to feel when there's no one there. He calls out in the night.
Even if it's 46 years later, you don't think you've got away with it, man. The words of one of the survivors of abuse by prolific paedophile Charles Napier.
Charles Napier is the half-brother of the Conservative MP John Whittingdale. Napier attacked 21 boys, one of them more than 100 times, a claim backed up by a new victim who our UK editor Rohit Kashru has spoken to.
His journey here has come far too late. A 13-year jail term begins tonight for Charles Napier, but more than 40 years after his campaign of abuse started.
Mr. Napier, do you intend helping the authorities?
We found him near his home earlier this year. He had no words, no apology for his victims.
Do you think you got off lightly because of your association with PAE, Mr. Napier?
The 23 boys who never understood their popular teacher was a prolific paedophile too.
Will you help them with the forest?
In passing his sentence, Judge Lorraine Smith said that he'd permanently damaged the lives of some of his victims, and in one case, a victim described him as predatory and evil. That same victim was abused by Mr. Napier on almost a weekly basis and tried to commit suicide when he was just 16.
Victims like Francis Ween, now a high-profile journalist, who as a boy was groomed with beer and cigarettes, then attacked in the school workshop.
I lurched backwards and pushed him away. And he then said, "Oh, come on, Francis," and spoke to me rather scornfully and said, come on, don't be a baby, don't be so babyish, don't be so sexually immature. This boy here lets me do it, this boy there lets me do it," pointing to two boys who were standing next to me.
It was a very eerie experience being in court today, seeing this man who I last saw in 1970 when I left the school. And he was sitting in the dock for 2.5 hours, and there was not a flicker of emotion on his face. I was looking at him as they gave details of these really appalling offences, one after another. I mean, the sheer quantity was the most appalling thing. And although he says he's full of remorse, you wouldn't have guessed it to look at him. He didn't bat an eyelid.
And there were many more victims. One spoke publicly for the first time tonight.
Now, I'd like to know how he got away with that, to be honest. But I didn't know, I was abused 3 or 4 times, or 3 or 4 plus whatever, I can't remember. But other children were 100 times. And yet none of us talked about it. None of us knew what was going on, none of us knew who were his favourites.
Napier helped run the infamous paedophile information exchange. This was its magazine, part of its campaign to lower the age of consent to 4 years old. The group's teacher, treasurer, even bragged about his abuse in letters to paedophile pen pals.
By now, Wrighton was Director of Education at the National Institute for Social Work. Yet he had a new secret to hide. He was close friends with a convicted paedophile, Charles Scott Napier. They were both active in a clandestine group, the Paedophile Information Exchange, or PAE. The group campaigned to legalize sex between adults and children as young as 4. Wrighton was member number 51. Napier was treasurer of PAE. His own paedophile collection included a pornographic computer game about boys in ancient Rome. As the game progresses, the boys lose their clothes. Charles Napier was a teacher. He had been banned from teaching in British schools after being convicted for indecent assaults on 5 of his pupils. In 1978, he got a job in Sweden teaching English to children as young as 11. To all appearances a respectable teacher, he was soon putting into practice his techniques for enticing boys. At the same time, he sent reports of his progress to his friend Peter Wrighton.
I've said goodbye to 2 classes, which had some heart-stoppingly beautiful boys. I've trained them to greet me in the street, and I always put my address on the board and invite visits. Every school form has 1 hour swimming each week. I now visit the baths, and I'm slowly building up a chart of which forms go when.
Napier soon had the chance to go further.
Nicholas visited me by himself and allowed me to caress him quite comprehensively for a few minutes.
Film obtained by Inside Story shows Napier in action. The film captures the paedophile technique called grooming. Alcohol has lowered the children's inhibitions. Napier prompts them to make sexual gestures. One boy leads another on. Peter Wrighton visited his friend Charles Napier in Sweden and joined Napier in courting boys. Two years later, Charles Napier applied in Britain to the Department of Education to be allowed to teach children again. Peter Wrighton, under the letterhead of the National Institute for Social Work, supported him with a reference. In spite of all he knew, Wrighton stated that Napier
no longer constitutes a sexual risk to children in his charge.
In Britain, Wrighton's professional reputation was still going from strength to strength. In the early 80s, he helped to draft a famous study, the Berkeley Report, which defined the jobs of social workers for a decade. He was also associated with another academic text, Perspectives on Paedophilia. Wrighton's contribution was a public clue to his private life. The book gave Inside Story an important clue to links within the paedophile underground. Another chapter is by Maurice Fraser, a former child psychiatrist. In his spare time, Fraser devoted himself to charities which took children away on sailing trips. In 1988 in Cornwall, Fraser helped set up the Azimuth Trust. Over 3 years, more than 100 children took part. Many of the children Fraser selected had learning difficulties. After a holiday abroad with a boy from Azimuth, Fraser began taking him away on visits to his London home.
Upstairs in this house, he had one big bedroom with one big bed, and he slept in another small room. When my friends came down, Maurice asked me whether I'd sleep in his room. At that time, I said, no way. You know, I knew there was something funny going on, but I wasn't that stupid. I just kept clear.
Later, Fraser took the same boy to the country and spent an afternoon with him and 2 other men.
At the time, I made a diary. I was 13. I wrote, I met a sculptor and a photographer and took 75 pictures of me, nude, and said I was a good figure and gave me £5.
Azimuth Trust has been closed down. Dr. Maurice Fraser, who has a criminal record for taking indecent photographs of children, as well as for indecent assault in 1972, is now living in Southampton.
Dr. Fraser, let's talk about Azimuth.
It's a waste of time. I have nothing to say.
Dr. Fraser, isn't it true that you took away at least one boy from Cornwall to see the sculptor and the photographer and took nude photographs of him?
Rubbish.
Dr. Fraser, isn't it true that you invited that same boy into your bed in Islington?
I've had the treatment, the past is behind me, and I'm saying absolutely nothing more. End of the story.
A man who founded the charity with Fraser has been jailed for indecent assaults on Azimuth boys. Fraser himself has not been prosecuted over his role in the trust. However, Inside Story has discovered that behind Azimuth were connections yet more sinister and far-reaching. Fraser was a link between boys in the trust and another paedophile circle. On a river trip in London, he introduced the boy from Cornwall to a party of men, which included a special friend.
I think it was just me, Gary, Morris, and the school teacher.
And what was the school teacher's name?
Napier.
The man who took the boy boating was none other than Charles Scott Napier, Peter Wrighton's old friend. On his return from Sweden, Napier had bought a house on an island in the Thames. In the 1980s, his home became a regular meeting place for paedophile men, including Peter Wrighton. One young man told Inside Story how from the age of 12 he was a frequent visitor with other boys. He declined to appear and is represented by an actor.
I suppose I wanted attention and a bit of love. Peter and Charles gave me that. We knew what they both wanted. We knew they were both in a group pie. We used to have to barricade the bathroom door in Charles's house to stop him getting in. He offered me money if I'd do it with him. I did think about it, but I could never quite bring myself to do it. I know others did do what he wanted. Charles used to talk about boys being past their sell-by date. That meant he weren't interested in them anymore. There were often old groups of boys as well as groups of men at Charles's house. David Bloomfield, who was something to do with science in schools, was one of them.
David Bloomfield, another member of the Paedophile Information Exchange, features in films shot by his friend Charles Napier. Bloomfield was chief executive of the Standing Conference on Schools, Science and Technology. He gave up the job last year, prior to being convicted of possessing indecent photographs of children. When we sought to ask him about his paedophile associations, David Bloomfield had nothing to say. Dr. Maurice Fraser, the psychiatrist and organizer of sailing trips for boys, has still not been struck off by the General Medical Council, despite 3 convictions, the last in 1993, for possession of child pornography. Last Friday, the Council announced that Dr. Fraser had agreed to refrain from medical practice. Charles Scott Napier, Wrighton's one-time friend, is Deputy Director of Studies at the British Council in Cairo. He recently wrote to a friend that Cairo is
a city full of boys, 98% of them available.
Due to police inquiries, he has been suspended from his job.
I would see Charles Napier as at the extreme end of abuse in terms of how prolific he was. The numbers would be very much on a par with someone like Jimmy Savile.
This is part of a much bigger picture, and a story that really hasn't been told yet, because I certainly spoke to victims in the 90s who told me that Napier actually was taking them to parties with the rich and famous, and those young men would not give us any details at all. And if Napier is as remorseful as he made out in court today, he could certainly help the police with the names of the people who were at those parties.
For his part, Charles Napier admitted that he was completely out of control, completely out of order. But with the police investigating the paedophile information exchange and their alleged connections to senior politicians and prominent people, more victims and further revelations may come out.
Nilofer Hadayat reporting.
This was an investigation that began with a question in the Commons. One enduring question is whether it will lead back to the British establishment.
Well, that's the point, isn't it, Rohit? Does this case have any impact on the inquiry into abuse at Westminster?
Well, Mark, this investigation began when Tom Watson, the MP, asked a question in the House of Commons about allegations about a paedophile ring with links to Westminster. Operation Fairthank began, and this is the first conviction to emerge from it. Now, tonight, Tom Watson has asked for more information. He's asking for more victims to come forward who might be able to shed light on Napier's potential associations with members of the intelligence service, with politicians, with members of the police force too. Why? Because Mr. Watson believes that there are 2, perhaps more victims of Napier who might have specific allegations to make against high-profile people who haven't come forward. Now, it may be that this investigation, which began at the heart of Westminster, might still return to the heart of the British establishment.
All right, Rohit, we'll see where all this goes. Thank you very much indeed.